So I'm calling the talk Nurturing Narrative Teams because I think the focus on nurture is really important. It's because having a successful narrative team is not just about building the team, although building and hiring is an important part of this process. It's also about empowering your team throughout the development cycle. Additionally, I chose nurture because it's not just the work of a lead or a director or a manager, although how people managers and leads advocate for their narrative team is very important. Everybody on the team can contribute to a healthy team dynamic. Every member of a team contributes to what that team feels like and how it functions. And so I also wanted to kind of shift the title away from maybe thinking this is something that you can only do if you're a lead or a director. So I chose the word nurture over something like growing or building because growing and building a team are parts of the whole process, which is to nurture and empower. You need a strong dynamic and a strong team culture to grow and build around. It's very hard to grow from nothing, so you kind of need those bones there in the first place. I am also a community organizer, and I entered this industry essentially through community. It was the community I found at DMG that convinced me that I could make my own games, and that gave me a place to experiment and find my own voice. It's not an exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be in this industry if it wasn't for my community at DMG and various other games communities that I found. So community to me has always been about uplifting each other and supporting growth through differences and collaboration. It isn't focused on competition, and competition is things like who gets paid more, who is getting more credit, who is stepping on whose toes. Community instead is centered on mutual growth, learning together, and just making cool things happily and healthily. Community also treats individuals as equal without hierarchy. So hierarchy can sometimes get in the way of empowering individual team members. So I kind of try to take this community approach to think about what are the benefits of community that we can take into a team without all the other kind of baggage that we get from hierarchy and that kind of stuff. So as both a team lead and a member of a team, I take this approach into how I try and shape team dynamics. Coming at this from a community-based perspective has me asking questions like, are people feeling safe? Are people feeling supported in their own learning and growth? Do people feel empowered to contribute? And important, are people having fun? Because if these things aren't being met, then the team isn't going to be operating at their best or their most cohesive. And we want everyone operating at their best. That's how good games get made. Okay, so to set some kind of common language first, I want to talk a bit about what a narrative team even is. Not all studios have in-house writers, let alone a full narrative team. So it's important to talk a bit about what these roles are, why they're important, and how we can better support both individual narrative people and full teams. So what is a narrative team? It's a big question, but I kind of like framing it as it's the team dedicated to supporting narrative, aka story, characters, player-facing text, and it's the team dedicated to advocating for narrative. Advocating for narrative is an interesting one because it feels pretty expected. If I'm a writer, of course I'm going to argue for the best story. But being an advocate means going in, knowing the constraints you're faced with, knowing the needs of other departments, finding the best story within those parameters, and then advocating for that story when things change, when cuts need to get made, and when decisions are happening at a breakneck speed, because they will. And a narrative team isn't always just writers and narrative designers. A narrative team can include anybody who is working in service of those two main things, supporting and advocating for narrative. So that includes people like project managers who need to learn the dialogue recording pipeline intimately, audio and voice designers, especially voice designers who'll be working directly with your recorded dialogue. QA, quality assurance, having dedicated narrative QA is a lifesaver. And they can catch things like when lines misfire, when a line hasn't been implemented or recorded, or if a change hasn't been made, or if anything that could possibly go wrong happens, narrative QA are there to find it. And trust me, a lot can and will go wrong no matter what size game you're making. So narrative QA, if they're a part of your team, are such a gift. But then game designers can also be part of a narrative team. I love when game designers are on narrative teams because then you have somebody advocating alongside you who understands that game design and narrative design are intimately wrapped up, and that when these departments are talking together, everything goes so much smoother. And by the way, these are just kind of like a handful of titles and roles that I've pulled out from various teams I've been a part of to kind of paint a picture of what a narrative team could be. But this isn't even the end of all the possible roles that could be on a narrative team. They're just kind of the ones that I think people don't often think about, and so I wanted to call attention to. And then there's the evergreen question of what is even the different designer? It's a bit of a trick question because a writer and a narrative designer are roles we're still honestly kind of figuring out. And they shift between not even just studios, but between what project you're on within a studio. And so rather than kind of use this time to nitpick over rigid definitions, I want to instead talk about what the general goal for a writer or a narrative designer is. And that is, once again, to be an advocate for narrative in game design, to ensure that the design and the game is coherently supporting the story is coherently supporting gameplay. And then, of course, there's the expected, like writing player-facing dialogue and text, and designing narrative systems, and sometimes even implementing the dialogue directly into the engine itself. I gave a GDC talk earlier this year, which feels like 9 years ago because that's quarantine. But apparently 5 months ago, I gave a different talk about why I view narrative design as actually being a part of game design. It's just kind of like a specialized subset, kind of like combat design or weapons design. And it's because narrative design is game design. It's just focused more on how the story gets told by the mechanics and how the gameplay itself is telling story. And so for me, that's why having a narrative perspective is important, even in non-narrative games, because it provides player motivation and aids player understanding. We as players understand what to do in games largely because we understand the context in which we are acting, and that context is more often than not narrative. So this means that these roles, like writer and narrative designer, kind of run the gamut from writing dialogue in a spreadsheet to designing full systems to working directly in the engine. But these roles function the best when they're treated as equal to other departments, which is why I bring up the idea that it's just a different kind of game design, right? So if we're treating narrative design as equal to game design and then letting them be in the room together, then the unique challenges and opportunities that come from narrative design are respected and given space to work through. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing specifically just on writers and narrative designers when I talk about narrative teams, since the workflows and the challenges I'm going to be getting into are specific to those roles specifically. I'm also going to use writer and narrative designer interchangeably with the assumed kind of definition of, and this is just my definition, it's not the definition, but with the assumed definition of a narrative designer or a writer is somebody who writes player-facing text with an understanding of design and a passing understanding of the technical requirements of making a video game. This definition is specific to how I operate as a narrative designer and is the general kind of rounded skills and knowledge I encourage in teams I work with and juniors I mentor. Um, and as I said, this is not the definition, and I don't want this definition to erase the differences that do exist in these roles between different studios. I just kind of want us to have common language to talk about going forward. Okay, so workflows. I love this kind of stuff. I love talking about team workflows, and I love talking about team pipeline tool stuff because it's so nerdy and cool. um, so I want to talk a little bit about like what are some of the specific workflows for narrative designers, and it's kind of a catch-22 because it also depends on your studio, right? And it also depends on what part of the production process you're in. You'll be doing different things at different times of the production, right? So this is by no means a comprehensive list, but it's kind of some basics just to catch up anybody who's maybe not familiar with what a narrative designer or a writer might be doing. So a day-to-day for a narrative designer could look anything like meeting with level or quest designers to co-design missions, then writing the scripts for those missions, then implementing the dialogue for those missions, then playtesting the build, then you're making notes on the narrative and the mission, then you're revising your script based on those notes and what you found during playtesting, then you're re-implementing, and then you're rinsing and repeating all of this until you're approved, locked, recorded, and shipped. The job doesn't really end until you're actually shipped because last minute changes happen all the time. But then there's also the other side of this job, which could involve things like meeting with other teams to discuss narrative needs for certain features, such as tutorials or flavor text that you might need for a weapon or something. Your job as a narrative designer could also involve pitching characters, plot lines, and missions to senior leadership. It could also involve sitting in the VO booth with actors or being on the mocap floor with actors or animators or whoever. Honestly, there's kind of a lot more that could get folded into your day-to-day as a narrative designer, but you get the idea, is that narrative designers are involved with a lot. And it's because we do a lot. And not only do we do a lot, and not only do we touch a lot of the game, we interface with a lot of those other teams pretty often. And so to do this, we need tools. So most studios don't actually have specialized narrative tools, but if you want to make a narrative team real happy and have the capacity to do so, asking them what their needs are for their tools and for developing those tools will earn you their love and respect forever. We love things that help make our job easier. And so for context, some of the things that we most commonly use are things like Excel or Microsoft Word or Google Docs or Final Draft if you're fancy and you have somebody who can hook Final Draft up to your engine. Most game writers have actually used Excel at one point or another because it's just really handy and it works really well for implementing into an engine. And so while it's not the ideal way to work or to write, we've kind of gotten really used to that workaround. Sometimes narrative designers do get to use specialized software. Some studios have proprietary script writing software. They also maybe have proprietary dialogue editors. Other studios use middleware, things like Celtics or Artisy, which are designed to kind of make the writing process a little bit easier, but then still need to be hooked up into the engine. So it's basically just replacing the role of Excel with a more specialized tool set. And then there are also some like purely just narrative game editors like Inky or Twine, which are things that you can use to create a narrative game kind of all on its own package without needing another engine or really anything kind of else. All right, so because we're a team that interfaces with a lot of other teams, and because we don't often have a lot of great tools, we run into a lot of challenges, both kind of individually as narrative designers, but also as a full narrative team. So this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but it is meant to be kind of an overview of the problems we kind of commonly contend with. And so some of these challenges are technical things, like budget. How much money you have determines how many lines you can actually write and how many of those lines you can actually get recorded. And then this shapes the entire way you can actually tell your story. Things like engine capabilities also affect certain parts of storytelling, like how many characters can we have on screen, what type of animations can we actually support. And then even if you're not dealing with actors or voice dialogue, how many words you can actually fit on a screen will determine how long certain lines can be. And then even aside from all of that, you just can't put narrative anywhere you want in a game. Hooks, we call, at least most people I've talked to have called them like narrative hooks, need to be built into the game, and then you need to be able to put narrative onto those places. So it's a lot of kind of talking and figuring out where you can put things and how you can best kind of put those things into the game. Another technical challenge is that often writers and narrative designers aren't even actually given proper access to play builds or to review our content. Narrative is kind of not always seen as a technical job, and so sometimes we can't actually run the build on our computer. But playing and reviewing the build is one of the most important things you can do as a narrative designer, because you want to make sure that everything is playing and working the way you intend it to, and there's no weird bits of colliding story. But then the other challenges we face are cultural challenges. And these are things like designers aren't always seen as technical, so we get left out of discussions that directly affect our jobs. Narrative designers often also aren't even seen as designers, so we also get left out of design discussions, which then directly affects our job. Both technical and design are impacted by and have an impact on narrative. So being left out of these discussions more often than not leads to issues down the road where something isn't being explained properly to a player, or a scene doesn't make sense, or something has been missed or doesn't actually work with the core of the idea of the game. So even for writers who aren't design or technically minded, being a part of these conversations helps resolve some of the issues before they actually become issues, because they were there in the room to talk about it. They were aware and they were thinking of the ways narrative is being affected or the way narrative will affect something. So now that I've kind of laid the groundwork a little bit for what a narrative team is, what a narrative team in practice kind of does and looks like, let's talk now about the topic of this talk, which is how can you nurture your narrative team within this overall process? And while these are tips that everybody can integrate into their team, I'm focusing specifically through a narrative lens, but I think there's a lot here that lends itself to other types of teams as well. So the first thing is it matters because who makes up your team is a key part of what type of team dynamic you're going to get. So hiring diversely matters because different perspectives bring in different ideas, which enrich and grow our games in ways we're not expecting. As game developers, we're constantly looking for what's new, what's the next innovation, and if we're only ever asking the same group of people this question, we're only ever going to get the same answers. So people with different life experiences, different frames of reference is how we're going to grow and expand what we currently are. Innovation comes from difference, and difference often comes from diversity. So I mean a few different things when I say respect differences here with this title. This is a big one, but it's a difficult one because we tend to also be friends with who we work with. But part of hiring diversely and part of creating a healthy team that's free to explore their unique ideas means we need to learn to respect differences. And when I say differences, I mean things like different life experiences, in addition to things like different hobbies or different strengths as writers. Our strength comes from our experience, and our experience is informed by who we are in the world and what we've experienced. To hire diversely and to have an inclusive team, you have to be able to respect that people have different life experiences as well as different life interests. Then, you need to take this respect of difference and apply it to the work people do. People have different strengths when it comes to writing. Some are better at comedy, others at structure, some at dialogue, some at character development, all of these different bits that make up the writing process, right? So empowering people to be good and to grow without punishing them for the areas they lack creates a team culture that actually encourages people to grow and be better. And honestly, as a lead, don't play favorites throughout this process. You might have a team member you're closer to or who you get along with, but for a full team to really mesh, you can't let favoritism become a part of it. It's obvious when you're a lead and you have a favorite team member, and it can be really demoralizing for the rest of the team. And it also works against the idea that differences are genuinely respected and appreciated on the team. So understand differences exist in experience and skills and how fast people learn. And then let your team become a place where people can use their different strengths to lift each other up, while also learning how to grow in the places and ways they need to from each other. A good way of supporting this process is having your team actually ask each other for feedback. It normalizes that everybody has different strengths and everybody can learn and grow from these different strengths, rather than seeing difference as a reason to feel less qualified or less good as somebody else on your team. And at the end of the day, it encourages teams to grow together rather than seeing each other as competition. So now that you have a team that's built diversely around the idea of respecting differences for growth and to discourage competition, uh, sorry, I said that weird. So now that you have this team and you're actively building it with this idea of growth in mind, this ideology needs to be implemented into the full team. And so this is a big one, and it's one of the most important ones for me. To have a really effective narrative team, you should be integrating your narrative team into the full production pipeline. This means not including a writer as an afterthought to meetings, but letting them be there from the ground up. Let them be a part of design meetings, of mission meetings, of progression meetings. If you're going to need a written line for it, or if it's going to touch narrative at all, let a member of the team be a part of that process. The amount of times I've been sent a task to write a line of dialogue for a feature, only to realize that feature doesn't make sense or is contrary to the player fantasy we wanted, is way more than once. And so including narrative in initial design discussion cuts off a lot of these problems right from the outset. And you'll also notice if this is something that you can do for your narrative teams, or sorry, this is something you can do for narrative teams, even if you're not a part of the narrative team yourself. If you're a game designer, ask for a narrative representative at your meeting. This might mean if you're a lead or a manager advocating for your team, for the narrative team to be present, it requires persistence, but it'll be worth it. This will make production smoother and also provide more autonomy to team members. Speaking of autonomy, Empowering individual ownership within collaboration has been pretty key for me for seeing members of a team happy and productive. Individual ownership can let team members flourish and grow. One way of doing this, to my previous point, is by integrating them into the full production pipeline and then having them be narrative owner of certain features that are specifically being developed by other teams. Let them own features, designs, and systems because it lets them learn how to set direction, how to problem solve within those specific constraints, all within the safety net of having you and the team to turn to when they need help. So what this looks like is relinquishing control if you're a leader or director, and letting members of your team be the narrative stand-in. Let them represent your team's ideas and the game's story, and you have to support them with this. Ownership doesn't mean sinking or swimming. It means having the opportunity to grow beyond current skills, but with the necessary support. It means giving them the space to learn how to make decisions. In order for your team to feel comfortable and confident in owning features, sorry, I'm getting a notification that we're running out of time. On the Zoom meeting.
Just keep going, Kate. I'll top up the minutes behind the scenes.
Okay, cool, perfect, thank you. Okay, so in order for your team to feel confident in owning features, you need to scaffold skills for autonomy. I realize scaffolding is maybe a word that comes from when I was working in kids education a lot, like the idea of like you're helping kids learn how to do things. And so I've taken that kind of vocabulary with me. And so I apologize. But anyways, you have to scaffold skills in order for people to become autonomous. So throwing somebody into a meat grinder as narrative owner doesn't help them if you're not providing support to them. So you have to prepare them and you have to support them. So ways of doing this includes pretty heavily how you give and take feedback. When giving feedback, provide the problem, not the solution, and then let them work through the problem and arrive at solutions themselves. And you also can't penalize or punish them during this process. It needs to be okay to make mistakes and arrive at incorrect solutions because that's how people grow. This is because feedback is part of the process, not as a result of failure. When writing games, everything is kind of a first draft until it's actually playable. And then when it's playable, bugs and issues will arise. And that's because writing for games is highly iterative. So feedback is a place to let your team members learn and grow, but they can't do that if they're not being properly supported or if feedback feels like a punishment. One way I found to avoid making feedback and iteration feel like a punishment is modeling accountability. If you made a decision that resulted in your team needing to drastically change their work, then you need to be accountable to that. Admitting and apologizing when you are wrong is key to letting team members know it's okay to make mistakes because we grow when we make mistakes. And not being accountable to your own decisions creates an environment where being wrong is apocalyptic, which closes team members off from trying and being honest. This has been difficult, I found, because it kind of sucks to be wrong, and it sucks to have to say you were wrong. But that's all pride, and I kind of honestly believe that you can't truly collaborate if pride is getting in the way. And speaking of pride, you can't view your team members as competition. Yes, us writers tend to be ambitious, and yes, we tend to want to climb the ladder of success as much as anybody, but the role of a leader, director, or a manager, or whoever, is to encourage this. You want to make sure your team is learning what they need to learn in order to one day be where you are, if not further. And if you're not a lead, but rather just a member of a team, it may feel like your team members are your competition if you are somebody who wants more growth, right? And you may even be made to believe that your team members are your competition, but they're not. They're really not. One of the most important things I've learned from community organizing, okay, got the notification. So one of the most important things I've learned from community organizing is that we are each other's best cheerleaders. We're each other's best teachers, best supports, and we're not actually each other's competition. We get better when we stand together and when we learn from each other. So trying to move away from this idea of our peers as competition is kind of tough because we have been a little bit ingrained to believe that we are through job scarcity and all those other things that come from that. And being able to view your peers and your team not as competition, but as a support requires a team dynamic that doesn't treat each other as competition either. And that's why having functional, happy, and healthy narrative teams is about creating an environment where we can view each other as support and as cheerleaders rather than just each other's competition. So this is all kind of encapsulated in this final point or this final thought here, which is you should be building a safe environment focused on growth first and foremost. If the base environment and culture you're creating isn't one where people feel like they can learn, then everything else is going to be so much harder. So building a safe environment is a bit of a combination of a few points I mentioned earlier, including being able to admit when you're wrong and taking responsibility for decisions, giving constructive feedback focused on growth, and not just rewriting without providing those kind of learning opportunities. You need to be able to, like, through how you give feedback, nurture and model this kind of growth. And it's also not viewing each other's competition, like I said. But building a safe environment focused on growth also includes things like sharing resources, so knowledge is dispersed. If knowledge is hoarded, then your team can't grow and learn from it. You're hoarding everything to yourself, which doesn't help other people around you. And I don't know how other people feel about this, but I also think genuine one-on-ones don't need to be formal, and they also don't need to be between a manager and a team member. We can check in on each other, check to see if people are frustrated, check to see if your team needs support. We can all kind of provide this place of accountability and growth for each other. And that's because healthy teams feel listened to, they feel supported, and they're able to act autonomously because of that. So I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised because I've been asked this before. But why does it matter? Who cares? And so it matters because we make better games when we're healthy and happy. And it matters because the people making the game matter more than the game itself. While I've been talking about narrative teams specifically, this applies to all teams within a production. Narrative teams are just becoming more common, their values being more properly understood, and so it's important that we make sure we're creating productions that allow narrative teams to be respected and integrated and allowed to do their jobs productively, so that we can all be happy and healthy while making a good game. So effectively, it matters because people matter, and team building needs to come from a perspective of creating an environment where that team can productively thrive. So that's everything from me that I have planned. Thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful, or there's something in there that kind of sparked a thought or inspired you in some way. I'd also be happy to take questions. If you don't want to chat here, you can reach out to me on Twitter or through either my CAPY or my DMG email. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. That was a very interesting presentation. Why don't we open the floor up for questions? I think you can use the raise hand feature, and then I can unmute you, and you can ask your question directly, or if you feel more comfortable typing in the chat, we can do it that way too. Dan, you have a question? I will unmute you. Oops. Where'd you go?
Oh, is this working?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, cool. So I had a question more regards to community. I'm less writing centric. How do you balance when you're trying to grow when you're trying to grow a community? How do you balance being persistent and getting other people involved in like leadership capacities, or just having more involvement versus organically having people being in, like how much do you have to go out of your way to get people involved versus people coming to you because or people pardon my language. How do you get people involved in I need to think about my question. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Do you mean like how to get people to like attend community events, or how do you get people to kind of like take on more responsibility within
Yeah,
organizing?
take on more responsibility, because on one hand, I guess you want people that are kind of maybe they're invested beyond having someone facilitate their involvement in the community, versus like when you talked about being persistent and being like, hey, you getting feedback and things like that. How do you apply that in the community sense, I guess? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it's something we're kind of constantly always contending with in doing community stuff, right? So DMG has been really special because it's a member-led community, and so I'm on the board of directors, but I was just a community member for so long, and so the way that kind of process worked for us, and the way we've kind of found a lot of success, is letting people, letting members of the community own and run events without having to be on a committee or without having to be on the board of directors. So we often will reach out to our community and be like, hey, what event do you want to put on? Or like, hey, it's Halloween. Does somebody want to run the Halloween event? And kind of letting individuals figure out what they're most interested in, and then letting them spearhead those events and those initiatives themselves with our support. And so they can bring an idea to a committee, and they'll have the committee or the board of directors there to help them. But it really is kind of letting people figure out what they're interested in and then supporting them in making that happen, which is very similar to narrative teams and like ownership and all that stuff as well. But for community organization specifically, because it does tend to be volunteer and it does tend to be around kind of passions, right? So for us, DMG is specifically about video games. You kind of also have to be where people are interested in being, right? And so we're not asking members to take on responsibility in terms of volunteering or running events for events they're not interested in. So a good idea and like I'm just talking generally about DMG because that's the best community practice that I know for answering this question. So take from it what you can. But we'll often just put a call out for volunteers and just see who gets interested, right? And then letting people volunteer for different things and letting people suggest different types of events and programming, and then just supporting them and seeing if there's interest. And if there's interest, then doing more and providing more of those opportunities. So it's kind of a combination of letting people run what they're interested in and finding out what people are interested in and catering towards that.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. We have a question in the chat from Michael. Does your narrative have a beginning, middle, and an end? And Michael, if you want to, I can unmute you too if you want to have any follow-up to that question.
It depends. It depends a lot on what kind of story or game I'm working on. A lot of traditional kind of games do have a very structured, here's the beginning of your story, here's the middle of your story, and here's the ending. And kind of video games are getting really clever at how they're mapping their interactive structure to that kind of three-structure act, or that three-act structure. A lot of what I write doesn't always, because I like kind of, especially my text adventures that I used to make before I started doing kind of working more with studios, were really kind of non-linear ideas, trying to explore different kind of pieces of a thing rather than a specific story. So my answer is yes and also no, really depending on if it's the kind of game that requires a linear story to follow through from beginning, middle to end, or if it's something more where I'm just kind of playing with an idea and I want to see all of the different ways players can get into that from different angles.
Great. Any follow-up, Michael?
No, that's fine. Thank you for your response. Yeah, I was wondering also, what's an ideal size of team do you work with?
I love a small team. I love a team of about 10 to 15 people. I think you get a really special mix when you have a team that's small, that's mobilized, that trusts each other. I've worked on games by myself. I've worked on teams where it's 5 of us, and then I've also worked on giant AAA games of 1,000 people. And they're all really interesting. Like, the scope of making a game with 1,000 people is the wildest experience I've ever had. It's so incredible seeing everybody just kind of working separately but together. But for me personally, I kind of like the structure and the energy and the dynamic of a team about 10 to 15 people.
Okay, I just had another thing came to my mind. I was just wondering, considering your experience as an editor,
Mhm.
and you probably edited in a more traditional story line type of procedure. How did you apply that to the video game industry? Like it sounds like now you're in more of a like how did you make that leap from traditional to nonlinear?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of very similar skills and transferable kind of ideas. I think the biggest and like easiest one to talk about is as a book editor, you're getting really used to seeing individual parts like chapters and sections as part of the larger whole, which is a lot of what game writing is, but also how you give feedback. And so the way I learned and was trained to give edits is a very kind of collaborative, constructive, present the problem, not necessarily the solution, understand their vision, and not necessarily what I would do, but what they're trying to do. And then applying that to how I give feedback to game scripts, to playtesting a build. And so just that really kind of collaborative feedback process is actually pretty similar between the two.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Now we have a question from Albertine.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was so enlightening. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I could pick your brain forever, but I will limit myself to one question for now. I wanted to know how you would recommend getting people who are interested in being a game writer or a narrative designer, or perhaps people who are already dabbling in games writing, how you would encourage them to attend events like game jams and stuff, because like here in Winnipeg's local sort of jam scene, we see tons of artists come out, certainly tons of programmers. Yeah, Dan is repping his Peg Jam shirt there. We see lots of programmers and artists coming out, and even quite a few people who are interested in music and sound design. But I feel like I see very few people who are more focused on the writing side of things, and I wonder, is that an issue of optics? Is that an issue of a lack of encouragement? Like, what is the best way to make people feel like they can participate in that scene, even if they're on the writing side of things?
Yeah, so I love this question because this is the kind of like my origin story. I remember I was on like the streetcar with a programmer for a game I was working on, and he was like, "You should go do this game jam." I was like, "No, I'm a writer. I can't program. I don't know how to do anything. Like, I can't make games." And he's like, "Yeah, you can. Just go do it. Use Twine." And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll just go do it then. And so I think part of it is optics. I think a lot of it is that we don't know that things like Twine or Inky exists, where you can just make a self-contained game, right? Text adventures are great. There's such a huge community around hypertext and text adventures within the game industry. And so you can go and just grab Twine, which is free. It's cloud-based, or you can download it, so it's super accessible. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of forums, so you can learn, or you can find answers to questions really quickly. And so I often try to encourage games writers to go to jams, either with Twine and just like make a short choose your own adventure. You're going to learn so much and so much valuable stuff that you can take with you if you do want to then go on and do this as a career. The other thing you can do is ask your friends who might be programmers or artists if they want to collaborate. I think a lot of teams don't necessarily think of including a writer, but most teams that I have talked to, or most people that I've talked to, would be like, "Oh yeah, I would love to have a writer. I don't have to do all that stuff then." So it's a bit of optics. I think it's also a bit of awkwardness, but there are ways you can go jam by yourself as a writer, or teams, or go work with teams. But I definitely I love game jams. I think they're so much fun, and I think they're such a great way to just learn how to scope a thing and ship it, because like learning how to scope and learning how to ship are two of the most important things you can do to be a successful games writer. So.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Kate.
And another question from you, Dan.
Yes. and I'm more prepared this time. So I believe one of your first slides was talking about community organizing is no hierarchy, everyone is equal. I'm curious, how do you drive a community group forward with, like, would you consider like people that are in a position of leadership within that group is in itself kind of a hierarchy, and is that not necessary in order to guide it in the right direction in the event that there's conflict within the group?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great clarification. I was wondering about that as I was writing it, because there's so many kind of like, there's steps to getting to that for me. And so for me, it's kind of two parts. Like being a member of a community means, like, that's what I was thinking about, not necessarily like being a community organizer, but participating in a community. Say we're all at a game jam and none of us are inherently above the other person at the game jam, right? Like that kind of community is what I was talking about, is everybody's equal, right? And that's where you're kind of supporting each other and collaborating together and doing a general like uplifting, versus trying to succeed more or be better than the other person. At least the game jams I've been to have been really friendly and warm and welcoming, and don't really do the awards or don't really do prizes. It's more just kind of about the communal act of making games together. But when it comes to like community organizing, there is a bit of that hierarchy, right? It's hierarchy insofar as people who have, at least for DMG, who have chosen to kind of take on the responsibility of doing things like conflict resolution or planning. But this is a thing I'm particularly contending with, as me and a few others are trying to build up our games writers circles and game writer events in Toronto for DMG. Is I'm a board member, but I don't want to take up too much space. And so what I try to do is do a lot of the like admin work for setting up the events. Like, yeah, I'll make the event, I'll send out the tweets, I'll do all that kind of stuff. And then letting the other members who aren't board members, but who are helping organize these things, kind of take on more responsibility that they want to in terms of leading discussion or kind of spearheading how groups organize themselves within there, right? So it's about like, yeah, I guess I'm in a leadership position in the community, but I'm using that in a way to uplift. And so kind of using it in that perspective, if that makes sense.
My follow-up question, I think you kind of touched on my follow-up question, which was going to be like, how do you, do community groups have a responsibility to be transparent, and how do you exercise that transparency? And I think you kind of answered it to a certain extent.
Yeah, and like, I love transparency. I think transparency is one of the most important things an organization can have. So DMG has all of our stuff available in a member manual that members can go and read, and it's at their disposal anytime. So all of our processes, all of our governance, all of that is available for members to look at, because we do believe in transparency, because transparency is kind of important for accountability and safety.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Some very insightful questions about narrative and community development, two topics that seem very near and dear to your heart, Kate. So thanks for those great answers. I'll open it up one last time. Speak now, or as Kaitlin said, you can reach out to her via her social channels, or for us. Oh, Cam has one. Cam, you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. I'm going to start my video too, because I want to be personable. Okay, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, two questions. So this first one might apply more so to your experience at Ubisoft, but how often did or do you find yourself fighting for narrative to have a seat at the table? I know you mentioned that narrative is a difficult position to define. Do you find that's true in other departments as well? Do you find that they have an understanding of what you do, or do you have to continually remind them?
So I've worked with so many different studios, and I've worked in so many different sizes of games, and I've always been such a loudmouth about it. I have 5 brothers, and so I very much came into this industry like, I know what I'm doing. I want to sit at your table. I'm not going to let you not let me sit at your table. So it's kind of a thing I've always put very front forward first for me, right? In interviews, I tend to kind of go towards studios that in those interviews share that kind of same philosophy and an ideology with me. I have had those fights at a variety of studios. It comes out in ways that I think you don't always expect, in terms of like, oh, like maybe narrative should have been consulted on this thing, but it wasn't. I'm trying to think of a non-NDA example, but I can't right now. So I feel like the more time kind of goes on in my career, the less I'm having those fights. And so like my beginning of my career is front loaded with those fights of trying to get narrative respected and trying to kind of have that seat at the table. And the longer I kind of go, kind of accept narrative needs to be here a little bit more. So I feel like those fights are petering out. And yeah, this is kind of true across the board, from indie to AAA to escape rooms to VR. I've worked in mobile. The one greatest truth is that the industry is kind of the same no matter what genre you're working in. It's just kind of a matter of scale of everything, right? So
Okay, cool. And I have one more question. It sort of plays off of Albertine's original question. But in terms of script writing tools, what would be the most worthwhile for a beginner games writer to learn? You mentioned Twine and Inky. I wonder if you have any other ones, or if there's a set of tools that have become more industry standard.
yeah, so I always advocate for Twine, because it's free, because it's great, because you can ship. It's not script writing, but it does teach you things about branching, and it teaches you variables, which are two really big, important design kind of concepts that you'll need to know for going on to do narrative design. It also teaches you about scope immediately, because the second you start branching too much and then you can't finish it, you're dang. So Twine is always my first go-to. Use that, mess around with it. You're going to learn so much. But in terms of industry standard script writing software, Final Draft, which is mostly used for movies, has become pretty standard by virtue of the fact of no studio has their own, or very few studios have their own. I don't necessarily advocate for learning Final Draft. You can pick it up pretty quickly if you understand script writing format, which is just indent for character name, dialogue. So I really think if you're going to spend the time kind of investing in learning something, learning Twine is the best bang for your buck.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
I did mention in the chat, but New Media Manitoba commissioned Amy Girardi to produce a Twine 2 walkthrough for our Girls in Gaming program. So it's pretty robust. I'm happy to email it to anyone who's interested in learning. I can tell you that whenever we do sessions in junior highs with Twine, it's always a really big hit from people who've never heard of the program before. They're instantly able to go in and start making a choose your own style adventure very, very quickly. So it's a very intuitive and easy to use program.
That's awesome. That's so cool you have that resource.
Yeah, no, we were really lucky to get that type of documentation. And there's also going to be some videos if I ever get around to editing them. Amy's also done a full screen recording of that PDF walkthrough. So stay tuned, I guess. Any other questions? And I see in the chat people who've asked for the PDF. I'll make sure to send that out to you after this session ends. Great. Well, we're at the 1 hour mark, so it seems like a perfect time to wrap. I do apologize for the technical issues that plagued this this webinar. Thank you so much for jumping on Zoom with us, and for all the great questions, and Kate, for your time and your insight and your expertise. It's really, really appreciated. We hope we can bring more of these to the community in the coming months. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. I had so much fun doing this. Yes, and we should talk games and games sometime, Kate. I'd love to get your insights on how we could maybe expand our Girls in Gaming programming around some of the lessons that you would be able to give us around that. Yeah, that sounds great. Wonderful. Well, everyone have a safe and happy night, and we will talk to you soon. Yeah, thanks again.